This is Bluebook Digital SAT number 8, Reading and Writing Module 1. As Mexico's first president from an indigenous community, Benito Juarez became one of the most blank figures in his country's history. Among the many significant accomplishments of his long tenure in office, Juarez consolidated the authority of the national government and advanced the rights of indigenous people. Well, the colon sets up a definition, so this is proving that he did important things. Oh, and I actually just happened to have said the word, so it's not unpredictable. Important, yes. Secretive, no. Ordinary, no. Artist M's intricate coiled baskets are blank sweetgrass and palmetto palm. Following a gullet technique that originated in West Africa, Dingle skillfully winds a thin palm frond around a bunch of sweetgrass with the help of a sewing bone to create the basket's signature look that no factory can reproduce. Well, if you read all the way to the end, no factory can reproduce implies that you're doing something by hand. So from the options are indicated by, handmade from, represented by, collected with, handmade from, right? Because she's actually physically winding the palm frond to make the baskets look. The Mule Bone, a 1930 play written by Z and L, is perhaps the best known of the few examples of blank in literature. Most writers prefer working alone, and given that working together cost H&H their friendship, it is not hard to see why. So if you only read the first sentence, you wouldn't know this at all, but the second sentence implies a contrast between writers preferring to work alone. So the fact that these two work together seems like it should be, collaboration. It's not characterization, interpretation, commercialization, collaboration as in teamwork. Diego Velázquez was the leading artist in the court of King Philip IV of Spain during the 17th century, but his influence was hardly blank Spain. Realist and impressionist painters around the world employed his techniques and echoed elements of his style. Again, the colon sets up the explanation. So the fact that other painters around the world used his style means his influence was hardly, as in not. Is it derived from, recognized in, confined to? Or repressed by. It's confined to. So his influence wasn't just within Spain because people outside of Spain leveraged his influence also. Researchers and conservationists stress that biodiversity loss due to invasive species is blank. For example, people can take steps such as washing their footwear after travel to avoid introducing potentially invasive organisms into new environments. Again, it's all about reading the entire question. The fact that people can take steps to avoid causing problems from the answer choices, biodiversity loss due to invasive species is preventable, undeniable, common, or concerning. It's preventable, as confirmed by the second sentence, proving that people can take preventative steps. Companies are providing consumers with more opportunities to purchase customized products than ever before. Whether buying customized sneakers, jewelry, or clothing, consumers can participate in the design of products to meet their specific needs and tastes. In turn, companies profit too. Studies have shown that consumers are willing to pay more and wait longer for a customized product. Still, it can be difficult for companies to offer customization while keeping costs low, as the standard methods of mass production may not be able to accommodate making a unique product each time. Which best describes the overall structure of the text? I'm just going to go one at a time here. It discusses several recent innovations in product manufacturing and then suggests some potential applications of those innovations. I don't think so. I think it's the process of whether you can make customized goods with its positive and negative attributes. So for a moment, I'm going to cross that out. It describes a company's recent success with new products and then explains multiple factors that may have contributed to that success. Definitely not because it's not a company. There's no company mentioned by name. It introduces a trend in consumer products and then explains how the trend both benefits and poses a challenge to companies. That sounds good. It presents two contrasting product marketing techniques and then provides examples of one of those techniques. It's not D, but let's confirm why it's C as in cat. Introduces a trend with more opportunities to purchase. So that is the trend, as I'm highlighting in blue right here. And then both benefits and poses a challenge to companies. So companies profit here, but then also it can be difficult for them to keep costs low. So there are positives and negatives associated with the new trend. Following text is from the 1924 poem Cycle by D, who was a citizen of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. There shall be new roads wending, a new beating of the drum. Men's eyes shall have fresh seeing, grey lives reprise their span. But under the new sun's being, completing what night began, there'll be the same backs bending, the same sad feet shall drum, when this night finds its ending, and day shall have come. Well, interpreting poetry is out on the end of the spectrum of difficult tasks, but thankfully we have answer choices. The main purpose of the text, to consider how the repetitiveness inherent in human life can be both rewarding and challenging. Maybe. To question whether activities completed at one time of day are more memorable than those completed at another time of day. I don't think so. I think the metaphor is new beating of the drum, as in a new take on life, a new era, has fresh seeing, has a new way of doing things. But, and then this is the pivot point of the poem, right? But under the sun's new being, there'll be the same backs bending, as in you still have to work hard, you still have to suffer, the same sad feet doing the same tasks again. So I think the metaphor leads to answer choice A, but always read all four answer choices. To refute the idea that joy is a more commonly experienced emotion than sadness is, no, it's about positives and negatives. To demonstrate how the experiences of individuals relate to the experience of... No, the metaphor is A, so the repetitiveness inherent in human life is rewarding and challenging, right? Yeah, there are new roads, but there's also still the same suffering. The North Celestial Pole, NCP, the fixed point around which stars in the northern hemisphere, including the sun, appear to rotate, is discernible only at night. Inspired by the navigational strategies of some insects and birds, researchers devised a method for locating the NCP in daytime using skylight polarization, which occurs as atmospheric particles scatter sunlight. A polarimetric camera captures images of polarization patterns, which rotate as the sun's position in the sky changes. Temporal variances across images can then be used to determine an observer's latitude and bearing relative to the NCP. So, dense, but which choice best describes the overall structure? It illustrates how most navigational tools utilize the NCP, recounts how researchers discovered that certain animals are able to navigate without using the NCP, and then proposes that that discovery could be used to avoid problems of navigation associated with reliance on the NCP. I don't think so. I'm going to cross that out. There's one that should click more logically with the various facets of this passage. It presents a celestial-based method of navigation, enumerates the comparative benefits of an alternative method used by certain animals that is based on an unrelated natural occurrence, and then indicates how the researchers assessed the relative accuracy of the two methods. I don't think the last part is correct. How researchers assessed the relative accuracy of the two methods? I'm not quite sure, though. I'm going to have to leave that. It explains how the NCP is typically located, emphasizes the key difference between how humans and certain animals use the NCP for navigation, and then suggests an alternative way of using the NCP to improve existing navigational instruments. I'm not sure that it talks about improving navigational instruments in the end. No, it does not. So it's not that one. It notes an obstacle to observing an astronomical phenomenon, mentions the navigational ability of certain animals that inspired a solution to that obstacle, and then explains how researchers used an optical device to mimic that ability. I think it's D. A polarimetric camera is the third part. The polarimetric camera is the optical device that mimics that ability. And then navigational ability of certain animals that inspired a solution is, inspired by the navigational strategies of some insects and birds. And then an obstacle to observing an astronomical phenomenon is the fact that the NCP is discernible only at night. So you can match the three exact parts. Culinary anthropologist V may be known for her decades of work in national public television and radio, but her book Vibration Cooking, or The Travel Notes of a Geechee Girl, is likely her most influential project. The 1970 book, whose title refers to S's roots in the low country of South Carolina, was unusual for its time. It combined memoir, recipes, travel writing, and social commentary, and challenged notions about conventions in food cooking. Long admired by many, the book and its author have shaped contemporary approaches to writing about cuisine. The book and its author have shaped contemporary approaches to writing about cuisine. So the outcome is the book and V have changed the way that modern people think about how you write about food. Describes the main idea of the text. S's unconventional book, Vibration Cooking, or The Travel Notes of a Geisha Girl, is an important contribution to food writing. That seems to pretty much match what's highlighted here, so let's leave that. S held many different positions over her life, including reporter and food writer. Well, that's obviously not the main idea. S's groundbreaking book, Vibration Cooking, or The Travel Notes of a Geisha Girl, didn't receive the praise it deserved when it was first published in 1970. That actually, I don't think that's not stated, and even if that were true, that's not the main point. S was a talented chef whose work inspired many people to start cooking for themselves. No, it's not that it inspired other people. It's that it was an important piece of work in writing about food. Okay. The following text is from William Shakespeare's play The Tempest, first performed in 1611. Miranda has lived on an island with her father Prospero since she was 3 years old. Prospero has stated that Miranda likely does not remember anything other than her life on the island. Miranda, 'tis far off, and rather like a dream than an assurance that my remembrance warrants. Had I not 4 or 5 women once that tended me? Prospero, thou hadst and more, Miranda, but how is it that this lives in thy mind? What seest thou else in the dark backward and abysm of time? If thou rememberest aught ere thou camest here, how thou camest here thou mayst. So, reading Shakespearean English is very challenging. I'm going to try to say what this means in everyday English. She's wondering whether she can remember her super early childhood before she came to the island, and imagining that I guess she had sort of servants taking care of her. And then her dad says, yes, you did, but how do you remember that? What else can you see in your memory? I don't quite understand what he's getting at with these last 2 lines, but let's look at the answer choices. In the text, which point does Prospero most directly make about Miranda and her memories? Miranda's reminiscences about her early childhood have a melancholy quality that betrays her discontented view of her current circumstances. I don't think so, because that would be saying she's very sad and it shows that she feels dejected and sorrowful about living on the island. No, it doesn't mention that specifically. That could theoretically be true, but that's not stated. Miranda's doubts about the accuracy of one recollection of a place other than the island are clouding her judgment and seem to be making her reluctant to explore her recollection of traveling to the island. Her doubts about the accuracy? I don't think it's that one. Miranda's ability to summon details of an experience she had before arriving on the island suggests that she may also be able to summon details of her arrival on the island. Maybe. In fact, now that I think about it, that might be what the father is hinting at in these last lines. If thou rememberest aught ere thou camest here, how thou camest here thou mayst. I think he's saying, perhaps you could remember something about how you got here. I think that's what that means. Miranda's impression of a scene is vague because she is remembering a scenario that she had daydreamed about as a child rather than a scenario that had occurred in reality. No, it's definitely not that one, because the father says, thou hadst and more, Miranda. So the father's confirming that at least part of her memory is correct. So it must be C, but it's a tough question. In a research paper, a student criticizes some historians of modern African politics, claiming that they have evaluated P, the first prime minister of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, primarily as a symbol rather than in terms of his actions. Which quotation from a work by a historian would best illustrate the student's claim? And again, the student's claim is they've evaluated that person as primarily as a symbol rather than in terms of his actions. So they've said, I'm looking at you as a figurehead rather than actually judging you by your policies. L is a difficult figure to evaluate due to the starkly conflicting opinions he inspired during his life and continues to inspire today. I don't think so, but let's leave that. The available information makes it clear that L's political beliefs and values were largely consistent throughout his career. Definitely not that. L's practical accomplishments can be passed over quickly. It is mainly as the personification of Congolese independence that he warrants scholarly attention. I think it's that. Many questions remain about L's ultimate vision for an independent Congo. Without new evidence coming to light, these questions are likely to remain unanswered. No, it's C as in cat because his accomplishments being passed over quickly matches with he's not evaluated by his actions. And then it's mainly as the personification of the country's independence matches with primarily as a symbol. Researchers hypothesized that a decline in the population of dusky sharks near the mid-Atlantic coast of North America led to a decline in the population of eastern oysters in the region. Dusky sharks do not typically consume eastern oysters, but do consume cow-nose rays, which are the main predators of oysters. So what I often do in these scenarios is draw a little diagram, as silly as it sounds, of what's actually happening here. So they're saying the population of dusky sharks going down. Let me adjust my window here and try to write a clear sort of, diagrammatic summary of this. Dusky sharks going down, they're saying leads to a decline in the oysters. So sharks down leads to oysters down. Now, sharks don't directly eat the oysters, so it's not that simple. There's an intermediary here. The sharks eat the rays. So whatever the answer is, it has to somehow pass through the rays as the intermediary, because the sharks don't directly eat the oysters. Let's go one at a time. Which finding, if true, would most directly support the researchers' hypothesis? Declines in the regional abundance of dusky sharks' prey other than cow-nose rays are associated with regional declines in dusky shark abundance. I don't think so, because that doesn't say what would happen to the oysters. I don't think it's that one, but eastern oyster abundance tends to be greater in areas with both dusky sharks and cow-nose rays than in areas with only dusky sharks. That's not jumping out at me either, but let's leave that. Consumption of eastern oysters by cow-nose rays in the region substantially increased before the regional decline in dusky shark abundance began. That would be saying the rays were eating more of the oysters while the sharks were still there. I don't think so, but I'm hoping it's the last one. Cow-nose rays have increased in regional abundance as dusky sharks have decreased in regional abundance. Yeah, that one's more straightforward and it clicks, because that's saying the rays, right? So the rays are what eat the oysters. So the rays going up matches with the oysters going down as the sharks have gone down, right? So now all together, right? So let's talk through the sort of food chain events, right? Sharks, I'll do it in red here. Sharks decline causes rays to go up, which causes the oysters to go down, which makes sense. So it's D as in dog. The musical H was produced off-Broadway in New York in 2016. A revised version of the musical premiered on Broadway in 2019 in a larger production. In a review of the Broadway production, theater critic Jay enthusiastically praised the musical's storytelling. However, Green also explained that he had seen the earlier version of H in 2016 and had found the storytelling to be very confusing. This suggests that, in Green's view, the 2016 version of Hadestown had fewer storytelling problems than the 2019 version did. No, it's the other way around. The 2016 was very confusing, so the earlier one was worse, so it's definitely not that. Hadestown should have had a larger production in 2019 than it actually did. I don't think so. The 2019 version of Hadestown was less enjoyable than the... No, again, it's the other way around, because he enthusiastically praised the storytelling at the later one, the one in 2019, so it's not that. Hadestown improved greatly between 2016 and its premiere on Broadway. Yeah, as in from 2016 to 2019, it got better. If some artifacts discovered from excavations of the settlement of KK in modern Ghana date from the 13th century CE, that may lend credence to claims that the settlement was founded before or around that time. There is other evidence, however, strongly supporting a 14th century CE founding date for KK. If both the artifact dates and the 14th century CE founding date are correct, that would imply that, well, again, silly as it sounds, let's go back and make a super simple sketch, which of course you could do on some scratch paper when you were actually taking the test. So the 13th century CE, which, just to be clear, is from the year 1201 to 1299. That's when they're saying it was founded, or at least that's the theory. and then the 14th century CE, which is, of course, from 1301 to 1399. If some artifacts recovered date from the 13th century, that may lend credence to the claims of settlements found. Okay, so, but if both the artifact dates and the 14th century CE founding date are correct, so if the artifacts, if these are actually if the artifacts are from earlier, and then it turns out that it was actually founded here, then the artifacts were there before the city was, or before the settlement was. Okay. Which choice most logically completes the text? Artifacts from the 14th century CE are more commonly recovered than are artifacts. No. The artifacts originated elsewhere and eventually reached KK through trader migration. That seems to make sense, right? 'Cause the artifacts were in existence first, before the city. KK was founded by a people from a different region that had previously been assumed. No. Excavations at KK may have inadvertently damaged. No. It's B as in boy, right? So when you reduce this all the way to its super, super fundamental elements, if the artifacts existed before the city, then the artifacts must have been made someplace else and then they ended up there, right? It's actually straightforward when you see the right answer. Birds of many species ingest foods containing carotenoids, pigmented molecules that are converted into feather coloration. Coloration tends to be especially saturated in male birds' feathers, and because carotenoids also confer health benefits, the deeply saturated colors generally serve to communicate what is known as an honest signal of a bird's overall fitness to potential mates. However, ornithologist A and others have found that males in several species of the tanager genus R use microstructures in their feathers to manipulate light, creating the appearance of deeper saturation without the birds necessarily having to maintain a carotenoid-rich diet. These findings suggest that. It's tough to process really quickly, but I'm going to try to jump right to the answer choices. Individual male tanagers can engage in honest signaling without relying on carotenoid consumption. I don't think so. I thought what it was trying to say is males in that species can manipulate the light. Yeah, so they can make it look like they are healthy even though they don't actually eat that food. Feather microstructures may be less effective than deeply saturated feathers for signaling overall fitness. I don't think it actually compares how effective the real way and the microstructure way is. Scientists have yet to determine why tanagers have a preference for mates with color. No. A male tanager's appearance may function as a dishonest signal of the individual's overall fitness. I think it's that one, because you can go back and match. So the deeply saturated colors generally serve to communicate what is known as an honest signal. So if you have the deep saturation from having eaten the special carotenoid food, that's an honest signal. However, some species can manipulate it. Yeah, so that counts as dishonest then. Formed in 1967 to foster political and economic stability within the Asia-Pacific region, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations was originally made up of 5 members: Thailand, the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. By the end of the 1990s, the organization blanked its initial membership. Has doubled? No. Had doubled? Yes. Doubles? No. Will double? No. This is just verb tense, right? Is past perfect. In 1930, Japanese-American artist C depicted the natural beauty of Yosemite National Park in 2 memorable woodcuts, Evening at Carl Inn and Lake Basin in the High Sierra. In 2019, Blank exhibited alongside 150 of Obata's other works in a single artist show at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. In 2019, it was, they were, this was, somewhere. Well, it must be referring to the pieces of art, right? The 2 memorable woodcuts, which one of them is named this, and the other is named this. So it has to be a plural pronoun. It has to be they were, right? Referring to Evening at Carl Inn and Lake Basin in the High Sierra. The city of Pompeii, which was buried in ash following the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, continues to be studied by archaeologists. Unfortunately, as Blank attests, archaeological excavations have disrupted ash deposits at the site, causing valuable information about the eruption to be lost. Unfortunately, so this is about commas for where you would pause. I'm going to try to say the answer choices one at a time, but simplify it to RS and CK. So here's answer choice A. Unfortunately, as researchers, RS and CK attest. No, that seems to be too many pauses. Also, if you wanted to do the pausing how they did it in A as an apple, the comma before and after means you can skip over it and it wouldn't matter. So let's try skipping over it. Unfortunately, as researchers attest, archaeological excavations have disrupted ash. Well, I guess maybe, but if you said it like that, you wouldn't know what researchers you're talking about. Let me say it with B. Unfortunately, as researchers, RS and CK attest. No. Here's C. Unfortunately, as researchers, RS and CK attest, archaeological excavation, yeah, that's the right answer. And then here's D. Unfortunately, as researchers, RS and CK attest, no. The tricky part here is explaining why it's not A. I would just say in the real world, it makes more sense to not pause. I'm going to say it one more time with A as an apple and then C as in cat. Unfortunately, as researchers, RS and CK attest, archaeological excavations, that's too many pauses. And here's C as in cat, the right answer. Unfortunately, as researchers, RS and CK attest, archaeological excavations have, yeah. Journalists have dubbed G the godfather of rap, a title that has appeared in hundreds of articles about him since the 1990s. S himself resisted the godfather blank, feeling that it didn't encapsulate his devotion to the broader African-American blues music tradition as well as bluesologist, the moniker he preferred. So this, from here to here, is not a full sentence. This is only a fragment. Let me say just that part again. Feeling that it didn't encapsulate his devotion to the broader African-American blues music tradition as well as bluesologist, the moniker he preferred. That's only a fragment, so it can't be B as in boy, because the thing on both sides of a semicolon has to be a full sentence. And it can't be D as in dog, because if you said it starting with however, that still doesn't make a full sentence. Let me say what comes after the semicolon with D as in dog. However, feeling that it didn't encapsulate his devotion to the broader African-American blues music tradition as well as bluesologist, the moniker he preferred. That's still only a fragment, so it's not that. Okay, so it has to do with pausing. So of course you have to pause after nickname. Do you have to pause after however? Well, let me say it with A. S himself resisted the Godfather nickname, however, feeling that it didn't encapsulate... It seems like it should be C as in cat, right? Here it is with the right answer. S himself resisted the Godfather nickname, however, feeling that it didn't encapsulate his devotion to the broader African-American blues music tradition as well as bluesologist, the moniker he preferred. Yeah. Over 20 years ago, in a landmark experiment in the psychology of choice, Professor S set up a jam tasting booth at a grocery store. The number of jams available for tasting blank. Some shoppers had 24 different options, others only 6. Interestingly, the shoppers with fewer jams chose to choose from purchased more jam. So, the number of jams available for tasting blank. Some shoppers had 24 different options, others only 6. Well, A sets it up with a colon, which means what comes after would define or explain. That actually seems to be the logical answer, but let's leave that. It's definitely not B as in boy, because that would be a comma splice mistake, right? The number of jams available for tasting varied. Some shoppers had 24 options, others only 6. Those are two different sentences that you cannot link together with a comma. Let me say it with C as in cat. The number of jams available for testing varied. While some shoppers had 24 different options, others only 6. Again, that's a comma splice mistake between varied and while, because that would be a whole new sentence. And then D as in dog. The number of jams available for tasting varied while some shoppers had 24 different options. No, that just blurs it together. So it's a perfect use of a colon, right? The number of things varied, colon, some had this number, others had this number. Sociologist T co-opted the term recombinant, normally used in reference to genetic engineering, to describe serialized television shows of the 1980s. G's use of the term reference TV studios' practice of repackaging successful narrative formulas as new blank even shows that varied only slightly from other shows still attracted sizable audiences. So I think what they're saying is recombinant. Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay, so he's saying they call it recombinant when you remake a show using elements from other shows, but it's different enough that it catches people's attention and it becomes popular. Okay. G's use of the term reference TV studios' practice of repackaging successful narrative formulas as new content, comma, in that era even shows that, well, no, that's a comma splice mistake, because this would be a whole new sentence right here. And then C as in cat is wrong for the same reason, right? Yeah, I'm going to say it with C as in cat. So use of the term reference TV studios' practice of repackaging successful narrative formulas as new content in that era even shows that, again, even if that made sense, which it doesn't, this would be a comma splice mistake. And then, yeah, D as in dog is, again, comma splice mistake right here. So it's B as in boy, which actually makes sense. The semicolon sets up two related full sentences. Let me say it with the right answer. G's use of the term reference TV studios' practice of repackaging successful narrative formulas as new content in that era even shows that varied only slightly from other shows still attracted sizable audiences. Yes. Although those who migrated to California in 1849 dreamed of finding gold nuggets in stream beds, the state's richest deposits were buried deeply in rock, beyond the reach of individual prospectors. Blank, by 1852, many had given up their fortune-hunting dreams and gone to work for one of the large companies capable of managing California's complex mining operations. Is it furthermore, still, consequently, or next? It seems like this is a logical result. So, even though they went there, although they went there dreaming of finding riches, the riches were hard to get to. Therefore, by 1852, they gave up and started to work for a different company. So, consequently makes the most sense from the Latin for to follow or following from, right? As a result, therefore. In 1974, Mexican chemist MM and U.S. chemist FSR discovered that chemicals called CFCs were harmful to the ozone layer. Their research was extremely influential in the fight against CFCs. Blank, it laid the foundation for a 1987 treaty that phased out the use of CFCs across the globe. I think that this is the detail that shows they were influential. So from the answer choices, regardless, specifically, however, earlier. I think it's specifically. The research was extremely influential in the fight against CFCs. Specifically, it laid the foundation for a 1987 treaty that phased out the use of CFCs across the globe. Yeah, this is a more detailed demonstration of how the research was extremely influential. Wants to emphasize the order in which Alaska and Hawaii became U.S. states, the order in which they became states. Alaska, the 49th state, became a state several months before Hawaii, the 50th state, did. Maybe. On August 21, 1959, it can't be that. The 49th and 50th states to join the U.S. did so in the same year. No, because that doesn't emphasize the order. The same day that Hawaii became a U.S. state, August 21, 1959, a new U.S. No, it just has to be A, right? In fact, this is almost a silly example of you don't even have to look at the bullet points over here. It has to be A. That's the only one that shows the order of the two states becoming U.S. states. Wants to contrast the emissivity of reflective metal fibers with that of silicon carbide fibers. Contrast the emissivity of reflective metal fibers with that of silicon carbide fibers. So whatever the answer is, reflective metal fibers emit this amount of whatever, and silicon carbide fibers emit less or more. The ability of reflective metal fibers and silicon carbide fibers to emit heat was determined by an analysis. No, because that doesn't contrast them. It has to show that they're very different. The amount of heat of a material absorbs is equal to the amount it emits Though the reflective metal fibers and silicon carbide fibers had different rates of emissivity, A planned to use both in a garment. I don't think so. Whereas the reflective metal fibers had an emissivity of just 0.02, the silicon carbide fibers absorb large amounts of heat, resulting in an emissivity of 0.74. So of course it's that one. That shows the the contrast. Wants to emphasize the role a misconception played in the naming of a place. The role a misconception played in the naming of a place. As in, some explorer decided to call something the wrong name because he accidentally thought it was something else. The novel Las Sergas de Esplandian featured a fictional island known as California. Well, it can't be that because that doesn't actually mention naming the place. To the south of the U.S. state of California lies Baja California, originally called California after a fictional place. I don't think that's a misconception in there, though. In the 16th century, Spanish explorers learned of a peninsula off the west coast of Mexico and called it California. That doesn't jump out at me. Thinking it was an island, Spanish explorers called the peninsula California after an island in a popular novel. It has to be that one, right? Thinking it was an island. That's the misconception. They interpreted what they saw wrong. Wants to emphasize the aim of the research study. Emphasize the aim, as in, what was the goal? What was the purpose? What did they try to figure out? As it orbited the moon, the K satellite collected data that was later analyzed by... No. Before 2008, K wondered if the moon was receiving some of its oxygen from Earth. Maybe, let's leave that. Cosmochemist K set out to determine whether some of the moon's oxygen was coming from Earth. That sounds better to me. K's study determined that Earth... No. So it's either B or C. C sounds like it more logically corresponds with an aim. That person set out to determine. But why is it not B? It's not B because... Okay, so now if you actually look back at the data, B is wrong with the data points. So Cosmochemist wondered if some of the accounted for oxygen could be coming from Earth. And then in 2008, he analyzed data. Before 2008, K wondered if the moon was receiving. I guess that actually is true, but that doesn't best emphasize the aim. The emphasizing an aim is he deliberately investigated this in order to figure out something. This is more like just wondering, but not deciding to actually carry out a scientific observation. So C is a better answer.